Our kitchen, where the refrigerator has handprints on the handle and the calendar on the wall, is 2 months behind and smells like something has always just finished cooking. The Delacroix family kitchen in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, looked exactly like that, a deep sage green on the walls that Mama had chosen back in 1987 and never once considered changing, a round table that sat five but had hosted 15, and a window above the sink that looked out onto a backyard where three children had grown up swinging from a tire that still hung from the old oak tree. That kitchen is where I was standing the morning of my baby sister's wedding, watching our family tear itself apart over a cheese board. My name is Celeste Delacroix. I'm 41 years old, a contracts lawyer in New Orleans, and the middle child of the three of us, sandwiched between my brother Rémy, who is 44 and has always acted like he invented being oldest, and my sister Josie, who is 33 and was, in approximately 16 hours, supposed to marry a man named Brian Sullivan. I say supposed to because by the time the rehearsal dinner was done and the morning of the wedding arrived, I wasn't sure there was going to be a wedding at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened that weekend, you need to understand what our family looks like from the inside. Because from the outside, we look fine. We look like a Christmas card. Three successful Delacroix children, raised by Mama, Odette Delacroix, retired schoolteacher, possessor of the best red beans and rice in the parish, in a house that was paid off and proud. Rémy runs an architecture firm in Atlanta. I practice law in New Orleans. And Josie, the baby, the one we all bent our lives around and didn't even notice we were doing it, became a middle school art teacher in Baton Rouge and somehow turned out to be the most grounded of all of us. Josie was the one we protected, the one we fussed over, the one whose report cards Rémy framed on his office wall like he'd written them himself. And when Josie fell in love with Brian Sullivan at 32 and called us all to say she was getting married, every single one of us said something that sounded like congratulations but felt underneath like caution, because Brian Sullivan was not what Rémy had planned for her. Let me take you back 11 months to the first time I met Brian. It was Thanksgiving. Josie had been dating him for 8 months, and the call had gone out. Mama wanted everyone home, and Josie wanted us to meet him. Rémy flew in from Atlanta with his wife Alice and their two boys. I drove up from New Orleans on the Wednesday night and sat at Mama's kitchen table drinking tea that was too sweet and letting Mama tell me things about Brian that she'd pieced together from Josie's phone calls. "He's a good man," Mama said in the way she said everything. "What does he do?" I asked. "He's in finance," she said. I didn't think anything of it then. Brian arrived Thursday morning with Josie, carrying a bottle of wine that turned out to be a very good bottle of wine, and a box of beignets from a place in town that Mama had always loved, but never thought anyone outside the family knew about. He was tall, with a quiet kind of confidence. He shook Rémy's hand and called him Sir without being flattering about it. He helped set the table without being asked, and when Mama told a story about a student she'd had 30 years ago, he laughed in exactly the right place because the story was genuinely funny and he was genuinely listening. I liked him immediately. Rémy, I could tell, had already decided something different. It happened after dinner. The women were in the kitchen, the boys were watching football in the den, and Rémy took Brian out onto the back porch. I know this because I was at the kitchen sink. The window was cracked, and sound travels the way it wants to in an old Baton Rouge house. I didn't hear everything, but I heard enough. I heard Rémy say in that low, measured voice of his that he uses when he wants to sound reasonable while being anything but. "Josie has always been taken care of. She's been protected. I want to make sure she stays that way." I heard Brian say evenly, "I understand that. I feel the same way about her." Then I heard Rémy say, and this is the part that lodged in my chest like a splinter I couldn't reach, "She's going to inherit a house, property in this parish that's been in our family since before any of us can remember. I just want to be clear about what belongs to this family." There was a pause. Then Brian said, "Rémy, I'm not with Josie for a house." Rémy said, "Of course not." But the way he said it made clear he thought the exact opposite. I should have confronted Rémy that night. That was my mistake, the one I've turned over 100 times since. Instead, I dried the dishes and told myself it was one conversation and that Rémy had always been protective. Brian had handled it well. Everything would settle. It didn't settle. By Christmas, Rémy had done something I still can't fully forgive him for. He'd hired someone, a colleague of his, who did background checks for commercial real estate transactions, to look into Brian Sullivan. He told me this in January on a phone call that started as a check-in and turned into a confession. He said he'd done it because he was worried. He said the results were inconclusive and that he hadn't found anything alarming, but that there were patterns he didn't like. What patterns? I asked. He's moved around a lot, 3 cities in 5 years. He was in a lawsuit, a business dispute with a former partner and Celeste. Here he lowered his voice as if anyone could hear him in his Atlanta office. He had a significant debt cleared about 18 months before he met Josie, right before he moved to Baton Rouge. Rémy, I said, you hired someone to investigate your sister's boyfriend. I'm protecting her. You're insulting her. She's 32, Celeste. She's never had a serious relationship. She doesn't know what men like this can. Men like what? My voice was sharper than I meant it to be. Successful men? Men who moved around in their 30s? Rémy, you moved to Atlanta. I moved to New Orleans. Josie's the only one of us who stayed. It's different. It's not different. You just don't want to admit that you've already decided, and now you're building the case around the decision. He didn't answer that which was its own kind of answer. When Josie called me in February to say Brian had proposed and she'd said yes, she sounded like the best version of herself, bright and sure and a little breathless. I said everything right. I told her I was so happy, told her Brian was wonderful. I told her I couldn't wait to help plan the wedding, and I meant all of it, every word. What I didn't tell her was what Rémy had done. That was my second mistake. I told myself I was protecting her from unnecessary pain. I told myself Rémy would come around once he saw how happy she was, that a background check was strange but not unforgivable, and that telling Josie would only start a war she didn't need in the middle of an engagement. What I was actually doing was managing everyone's feelings except my own. Lawyers are good at that. We learn to process the emotion out of situations until they become problems to be solved. The problem with doing that in your family is that eventually the emotion finds another door. The door it found was the wedding weekend. The Beaumont Inn was a restored Creole cottage 10 minutes from Mama's house, where we'd block booked rooms for the out-of-town guests and for Rémy and his family. It was a Friday in April, azalea season, and the whole town smelled like something was beginning. Josie had planned everything herself, small and tasteful. Dusty rose and champagne. There were 50 guests. A dinner at the inn the night before, the ceremony at the church Mama had attended her entire adult life, and a reception in the inn's courtyard. It should have been perfect. I arrived Friday afternoon and found Rémy already in the parlor with Alice, holding a glass of sweet tea and wearing the expression he always gets. His boys, 12 and 9, full of energy and no awareness, were chasing each other around the garden outside. Celeste, he said. Rémy. I set my bag down and sat across from him. What's wrong? Why does something have to be wrong? Because you're sitting in a parlor at 3 in the afternoon looking like you're about to read someone their rights. Alice, to her credit, found something to look at in her purse. Rémy set down his tea. I had a conversation with one of Brian's former colleagues this week, a man he worked with at a firm in Houston. I felt something cold move through me. Rémy. This man said Brian left the firm under circumstances that were never fully explained, that there was a client whose money went missing during a transition, and that Brian was never formally accused but was asked to leave. You're still investigating him. It's Josie's life, Celeste. You hired someone to investigate the man your sister is marrying 2 days before the wedding. I already had the contact. I just asked a question. I looked at him for a long moment. My brother, who I have known for 41 years, who taught me how to ride a bike and who cried at my law school graduation when he thought no one was watching, who has spent his entire adult life believing that love is something you protect people from rather than something you protect. Are you going to tell her? I asked. I think we should. We? You're her sister Celeste. She'll take it better from... No. I heard the word come out of me clean and flat. I'm not doing that. If you want to blow up her wedding with a second-hand story from someone who may have his own reasons for saying what he said, you do it yourself. I won't be part of it. Remy's jaw tightened. If Brian takes her money, Josie is a middle school art teacher in Baton Rouge, I said quietly. She doesn't have money to take Rémy. She has a small savings account and a family home she'll share equally with the two of us when Mama is gone. If Brian Sullivan is a gold digger, he has extremely poor research skills. Alice made a sound that was almost a laugh and immediately converted it to a cough. Rémy stood up. I'm going to talk to Mama. Good luck, I said. And I meant it because Mama was the one person in the world Rémy had never successfully managed. Let me tell you what happened at dinner that night, because I want you to be in that room. The inn's dining room was long and narrow, lit by candles in mismatched holders, Josie's touch, every detail deliberately imperfect and warm. There were 12 of us at the table: Mama, Rémy, Alice and their boys, me, Josie and Brian. Brian's mother Darlene, who had driven in from Shreveport, his best man Terence, Josie's best friend Roger, and Josie's colleague from school, a woman named Bev, who had made the wedding cake and sat at the end of the table looking quietly thrilled to be included. Josie was radiant. She was wearing a cream dress, her natural hair out, her whole face doing something it doesn't do when she's worried about things. It was just open. Brian sat beside her with his hand on the back of her chair, not performing affection, just resting there. He and Terence were telling a story about a camping trip they'd taken 5 years ago that had gone very wrong, and everyone was laughing. And for the first 45 minutes of that dinner, I allowed myself to believe that we were going to make it through. Then Remy's oldest son, who is 12 and has never once in his life read a room, looked at Brian and said brightly, Daddy says you used to work in Houston. There was a small silence. Then Brian smiled. I did, years ago. Did you like it? Cody, Alice said. It's fine, Brian said. Houston was good. Not where I was meant to stay, but it was good while it lasted. Rémy was looking at his plate with the focused attention of a man who desperately wanted his 12-year-old to say more. Darlene, Brian's mother, a small woman with silver locks and the kind of posture that suggests she has opinions about posture, looked at Rémy and said pleasantly, And you're in Atlanta? Architecture, Josie told me. That's right, Rémy said. Beautiful city, though I find it's grown faster than it's grown thoughtfully. She said this with a sweet smile that made it impossible to be sure whether it was an observation or a verdict. Remy's chin lifted slightly. There's an argument for both sides. There usually is, Darlene agreed. Roger, who has known Josie since the 3rd grade and has the particular gift of making conversation land like a soft landing, raised her glass and said, Can we do toasts? I've been practicing mine since Tuesday, and if I don't say it soon, I'm going to forget the good part. Everyone breathed again. It was after dinner, after the toasts and the dessert wine, after Bev had told us more about the cake's construction than we needed but genuinely wanted to know, when Rémy asked Brian to step outside. I saw it happen. I watched Rémy set down his napkin with the deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed the gesture and lean toward Brian and say something quiet. I watched Brian's expression stay exactly the same, which told me he'd been expecting this. I watched Josie across the table not see it happen because she was showing Darlene something on her phone. I stood up and followed them. The porch was cool, smelling of night jasmine. You could smell the river just beyond the trees. Rémy had his back to me. Brian was facing him, with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set. His expression was controlled. I can't go into a marriage without answering for this, Rémy was saying. I don't owe you an answer, Rémy. You owe my sister transparency. Josie knows everything about me, everything. We talked about Houston before I even asked her to date me exclusively. I told her about the investigation. There was an investigation? It was a compliance review. It touched everyone in the department. I was cleared. Completely cleared, and I can show you the documentation if you need to see it, but I'll be honest with you, I don't think you need to see it. I think you made up your mind about me before you shook my hand at Thanksgiving, and you've been building the prosecution ever since. I stepped forward. Rémy, both men turned. Celeste. No, I said. I was done being careful. I'm not watching you do this, not tonight at her rehearsal dinner. I looked at my brother the way you look at someone when you're done managing them. Josie knows about Houston, Brian just told you that, which means the only one here without full information was you, and you used that gap to hire investigators and have back-channel conversations with strangers about a man you have never once genuinely tried to know. Rémy opened his mouth. I'm not finished. I heard my courtroom voice come into me, the one that means I'm about to say something with weight. You have been so certain that someone is going to take something from Josie that you have never once considered that maybe what Josie found is someone who sees her the way we're supposed to see her, not as something to be protected from the world, as a woman who made a choice. The three of us stood on that porch for a long moment. Brian looked at me and said quietly, "Thank you." Rémy said nothing. I went back inside. What I didn't know, what none of us knew until later that evening when Alice came and found me in the hallway with her heels in her hand and her face carefully composed, was that Rémy had not kept the investigation to himself. He had told Mama. Not the version he'd told me, a different one. He had told Mama a version that was worse, that the Houston story was about a client who'd been defrauded, that there were serious questions, that Brian had financial motivations. He had sat with Mama after lunch that day in her kitchen and done the thing he'd always been best at, making worry sound like wisdom. She didn't sleep last night, Alice told me. She looked exhausted. He told her before we even got here. That's why she was quiet at dinner. She wasn't tired, Celeste. She was afraid. I felt something tighten in me. Did she say anything to Josie? No, Odette wouldn't do that, but you know your Mama. She carries things. Alice looked at me with real sorrow in her eyes. He said he was doing it to prepare her, in case. In case? In case it all fell apart and there were finances to sort out. He said he wanted Mama to understand what she might be signing over. I walked away from Alice mid-sentence. I wasn't rude. I walked away because if I didn't move, I was going to say something in a hallway that needed to be said in a room. I found Mama in her room sitting in the armchair by the window with a glass of water she hadn't touched. The room smelled like her, like lavender, and a particular brand of hand cream she'd used my entire life. She looked small in that chair, and when I came in, she looked up at me with the face she makes when she already knows what you're about to say. I sat on the edge of the bed. He told you, she said. Alice told me he told you. Mama looked out the window. He's scared for her. I know he is. He's always been scared for her since she was born. You remember how he was when she was little. He wouldn't let her ride her bike without him running alongside. She was 9, Celeste, 9 years old, and he was still running. I remember. That's love, Mama said. That's love that doesn't know how to let go. I know it is, I said, but Mama, it's also wrong. What he did is wrong. He's been investigating Brian for months. He told you things without full context, without Brian's side, and tonight Brian told Rémy that Josie already knows everything. He was transparent with her before they were even serious. Mama was quiet. She chose him, I said. Josie chose him knowing the whole story, and what Rémy is doing, what he told you, it takes that choice away from her. It makes her feel like she needs to be protected from her own judgment. Mama's hands were in her lap. They were still, which is how I knew she was working something out. He cleared it, she finally said. What? Rémy told me there was an investigation. He didn't tell me Brian was cleared. She looked at me. Is he telling the truth, Brian? I believe him, and I believe Josie would know if he wasn't. There was a long pause, then Mama said, Go to bed, Celeste. Let me think. I kissed her forehead and went. The morning of the wedding, I want you to picture the house again. Josie was getting ready in her old bedroom, the one with the purple curtains she'd put up at 14 and Mama had never taken down. Her bridesmaids were with her. The sound coming from that room was the sound of women getting ready together, which is its own specific music. Hair tools, laughter in somebody's playlist, and the occasional sharp intake of breath when a zipper does what it's supposed to. I was in the kitchen with coffee, watching the backyard, watching the tires swing move in a small morning breeze when Rémy came downstairs. He looked like he hadn't slept. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter, and for a while neither of us said anything. This is something we learned as children, that silence in this kitchen has its own language. Finally he said, Mama came to my room last night. What did she say? He laughed, a short sound with no humor in it. She told me that if I didn't settle this today, right now, before the ceremony, she would tell Josie everything I'd done, and that I'd have to live with Josie knowing what I did on the morning of her wedding. I wrapped my hands around my mug. She also said, his voice changed. Something cracked in it. She said she's been watching me hold on to Josie since she was born, and that at some point holding on becomes taking, and that she didn't raise me to take from my sister. I didn't say anything. Sometimes the most important words are the ones you don't add. Rémy set down his coffee and rubbed his face with both hands. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, in a voice I hadn't heard from him in years, the one he used when he was a kid and had broken something and was figuring out how to say so, I need to talk to Brian. Yeah, I said. You do? I wasn't there for that conversation. I don't know every word that was said. What I know is what Brian told Josie later on their honeymoon, and what Josie told me when she called me from the coast, that Rémy had knocked on Brian's door at 8 in the morning, hat in hand, and had said that he'd been wrong. He was wrong the way he'd expressed it, that he had let fear dress itself up as protection and hadn't noticed until it was too late or almost too late. That he'd shown him the documentation without being asked, the clearance letter from the compliance review, the resignation that was mutual and clean, his whole story laid out, and Rémy had looked at it all, and then looked at Brian and said, she loves you. Brian had said, I know, I'm going to spend my whole life trying to deserve it. Rémy had nodded, and because he is still Rémy and always will be, he'd said, if you hurt her, you'll have 2 lawyers and an architect coming for you. Brian laughed. I'd expect nothing less. The church was golden in the afternoon light, the way Baton Rouge gets in April. 50 people in the pews, Mama in the front row in her blue dress, one white gardenia in her hair that Josie had pinned there herself. When the doors opened and Josie came through, the whole room gasped. She walked in like when a person who is completely sure of what they want walks into a room. Everything adjusts around them. She was magnificent. She walked herself down the aisle. This had been the plan from the beginning, a small rebellion against a tradition she'd never quite accepted, and Rémy had argued against it for months. But that morning, when she come downstairs in her dress for the first time and he'd seen her, he'd let it go. I watched him let it go. I watched 44 years of big brotherness step back and let her walk. She walked with her shoulders back and her eyes on Brian, and a smile that was so private and so specific to the two of them that I felt like I was witnessing something that was none of my business and absolutely everything I needed to see. The ceremony was 20 minutes short by choice. Josie had said she didn't see why anyone needed more than 20 minutes to say something that took 3 seconds to feel. When the priest said, you may kiss your bride, and Brian tucked Josie's face in his hands like something precious and kissed her like they were the only 2 people in a church that held 50. Mama wiped her eyes and smiled. At the reception, the courtyard of the Beaumont Inn was strung with lights and smelling of jasmine and whatever was in the baked brie Bev had brought as a gift. Roger gave the toast she'd been practicing since Tuesday. It was about the 3rd grade and about a clay sculpture Josie had made of a horse that was so anatomically creative that the teacher had sent a note home about how even then, even at 8 years old, Josie had looked at the note and said, but I can see it. Josie has always been able to see what the rest of us miss, Roger said. I think that's what we call vision, and I think that's what she saw in Brian. She lifted her glass. To the bride and groom, may you always see what the rest of us are slow to find. I watched Rémy raise his glass without hesitation. I watched him look at Brian and nod once, slow and genuine. I thought, that's enough. For today, that's enough. Something happened I didn't know was coming. 3 months after the wedding, I was in my office in New Orleans when Josie called. She'd been on her honeymoon and back, and she had the full, easy voice of someone who'd slept well for 6 weeks straight. She said, Celeste, I know. I knew immediately what she meant. Josie, don't. I know what Rémy did. Brian told me everything after the honeymoon. He wanted me to know before anyone could tell it to me wrong. She paused a while. He showed me the documentation too, the clearance, the whole story. I'm sorry, I said. I should have told you months ago. I should have told you when I found out what Rémy was doing. You should have, she agreed. What did you say to Rémy? I haven't talked to Rémy yet. I'm calling you first because you're the one who stood up for Brian on that porch, and I wanted you to know I know that. Another pause. I'm going to call Rémy next, and it's going to be a hard conversation, but Celeste, her voice did something complicated, something that was love and exhaustion all at once. He's still my brother. This is going to cost something, but I'm not going to let it cost everything. I sat at my desk with the phone pressed to my ear and felt something release in me. You're remarkable, I said. I'm just tired of people protecting me from my own choices, she said. Starting now, nobody protects me. I protect myself, okay? Okay, I said. Good. Now tell me everything you know about prenuptial agreements because Brian and I are going to revisit the one Remy's lawyer apparently mailed him with no return address 2 weeks before the wedding. I actually laughed out loud. On that, I said, I am absolutely the right person to call. That phone call with Josie was the beginning of the end of me staying quiet in this family. I wrote Rémy a letter that took me 3 weeks and 4 drafts. In it, I told him what I knew, when I'd known it, and why I hadn't said anything sooner. I told him I loved him and that I'd spent too long managing the space between the people I love and the truth they need to hear, and that I was done doing that. I told him that protecting Josie and trusting Josie were two different things, and that all of us, including me, had confused them for years. He called me after he read it. He was on his back porch in Atlanta. I could hear the particular silence of it, and he was quiet for a long time after he said hello. Then he said, I owe you an apology too. I asked you to carry something with me that wasn't yours to carry. You did, I said, and I let you. That's on me. Are we okay? He asked. We're going to be, I said, which was the most honest answer I had. Brian and Josie have been married for 8 months now. They spent last Christmas at Mama's, all of us, Remy's family, Darlene and her husband Raymond, Roger and her new girlfriend who is very tall and very quiet and seems entirely overwhelmed by our family, which is fair. Bev came too and made something with cardamom that nobody had eaten before and everybody wanted more of. It was loud and crowded. The kitchen smelled like something had always just finished cooking. At one point, I looked across the table and saw Rémy passing the bread basket to Brian, and Brian saying something that made Rémy laugh, the real laugh, not the polished one, the actual one. I thought about all the Thanksgivings and Christmases and ordinary Tuesdays that almost didn't happen, all the space that nearly got swallowed by one person's fear. Then Josie caught my eye from across the table and tilted her head just slightly in the way she's done since she was small, a question and an answer at the same time. I tilted mine back. We were okay. I'll end this the way Josie ended her vows, with something plain and true. You cannot love someone into smallness and call it protection. Love that has to manage and control and investigate is love that has not yet learned to trust, not just the person it's aimed at, but itself. The love that Rémy had for Josie was real, but it had calcified around an old fear, the fear of being the one who didn't see it coming, the one who didn't protect her in time, and that fear cost him months of his sister's goodwill, a wedding week that nearly broke, and a relationship with his brother-in-law that had to be rebuilt from a handshake on a morning when it could have easily not happened. The lesson I took from that kitchen, that porch, that church, that courtyard strung with lights, is that the people we love most are not ours to keep. They are only ours to trust. If someone in your life is confusing control with love, or if you are that person, the one doing the controlling and calling it care, ask yourself what you're afraid of, because the fear is always underneath, and the fear, unlike the control, can actually be talked to. Josie knew. She knew everything about Brian, and she chose him with her whole self. None of us gave her enough credit for that. None of us asked ourselves why we needed to see the file that she'd already read and set aside. Give the people you love the dignity of their own choices, that's all, that's the whole thing. If this story moved you, sat with you, or reminded you of someone, please subscribe to Story Junkie. Every week we go into the real places where families are complicated and love is messy and people still somehow find their way. Tap that subscribe button and come back. We're just getting started. Take care of you and God bless.